The snows from Halloween had melted, but the weather had remained cold. The winds were picking up, the animals were going to ground, and soon it would be time to get the Christmas decorations out of the attic again. Appalachia was a truly beautiful place, and as I settled in for another winter with Grandpa, I secretly hoped that it would last forever. Grandpa was busy with his carvings, trying to get a little surplus up before spring, and working on some Christmas carvings as well. He was in high spirits, humming carols as he shaved off the finer edges of the animals he was whittling, and I couldn't help but smile. Grandpa was about the only person who could get away with humming Christmas carols before Thanksgiving, without getting an earful. I had worked retail for most of my life before coming here, and Christmas carols before December still elicited a nearly overpowering rage in me. As I sat down, I sighed contentedly as I soaked it all in. This was a peaceful feeling that I could get used to. "I really love it here," I said. "This time of year always reminds me that I'd come and stay here around the holidays so Mom and Dad could get the shopping done." "Yeah, this time of year your grandma always loved best. She lived for cooking turkey and making pies, dipping holiday candles, and just spending time with the family." "I remember helping her dip candles," I said, laughing. "Well, I remember making a mess while she tried to show me how to dip candles the right way." Grandpa laughed, almost dropping the bird he'd been working on. "I remember that. God, what a mess. She had to go back and fix them once you were done, but she waited till you went back home since she didn't want to hurt your feelings." I could see a few of Grandma's candles still sitting on the mantelpiece, the sage ones that she had made the summer before she passed. She had been diligent right up to the end, and her death had been so sudden that it had taken everyone by surprise. Grandma had seemed like such a larger-than-life character. The two of them had gone together like hand and glove, and without her, Grandpa had been lost for a while. Having someone else around, though, seemed to have revitalized him, and I was glad that I could be that person. "What was Grandma like when the two of you were young?" I asked, never having thought about it before. Grandpa had told me so much about his own youth, but I hadn't heard him talk about Grandma yet. Somehow I'd always thought of them as childhood sweethearts, playmates who had grown to love each other, but I couldn't think of many cases where either had talked about how they met. "Actually, your Grandma was one of the few things I brought back from Alaska with me." I was speechless for a moment, not expecting that. "Wait, you met Grandma in Alaska?" He shook his head at me. "Well, of course. Where else?" "I don't know. I guess I just assumed that she was someone you knew before the war." "Nope. Your Grandma was 1 in a million, and I had to go a long way to find her." He looked up at the wall where a picture of the two of them smiled back at him. It had been taken at the stall at the flea market. The two of them looked as happy as I'd ever seen them. It had been about 5 years ago, at the height of spring, and Grandpa's table had been filled with squirrels and birds and all kinds of little animals that seemed to stare back at the camera with equal glee. They had been celebrating their 50th anniversary. The two of them looked ready to celebrate 50 more. I sat there for a minute, patting the armrest expectantly, but Grandpa had gone back to his bird. He was scraping wood away from the plumage again, letting them fall in curls to the tabletop as he worked. He was invested in the project and seemed like he'd forgotten our conversation. When I cleared my throat and brought him around again, he looked a little confused. "I don't usually have to set you up for a story, Gramps. What's the deal?" Grandpa laughed, rolling his eyes as he held the bird up to get a better look. "Jesus, boy, is that all I'm good for, is telling stories?" Even so, he cocked his head as he thought about how to begin, the tool still shaving wood away from what was starting to look like it might be a cardinal. "I suppose it all started over pie, though it ended with something much worse. Your grandma had moved to Alaska with her folks about a year before the war ended. Her old man was some kind of researcher with the government, studying mining operations in Alaska, and she and her mother lived in a little town whose name I can't quite remember,
while her father mostly traveled. She was working in a diner on the outskirts when I first saw her. The place looked very American, out in what was considered the untamed frontier by many. It looked like a big silver trailer, one of those diners you saw popping up along the highway of the Midwest, and the waitresses wore pink and white striped uniforms, and the kitchen smelled like grease. They were doing pretty well, despite their isolated location among the muddy road to Taylor. They got a lot of trade from the gas trucks and the mail trucks and the guys like me who were hauling this and that somewhere else, and when I first pulled up into the Wild Skies diner, finding love was the last thing on my mind. To tell the truth, it was not pissing my pants or having to shiver by the side of the road as I did my business. I had come charging in and almost knocked her over in my hurry to get to the bathroom, nearly caused her to drop a tray. As my hand reached out to palm the tray she'd been carrying, I locked eyes with her and was suddenly enchanted. "Whoa there, fella," she said, her voice making me homesick for some reason that I would later learn about. "Where's the fire?" I was a little tongue-tied after that, trying to get my bearings so I could do more than flounder like a landed fish, and managed to choke out something about a bathroom as I passed her the food tray. She pointed me back outside, indoor plumbing being a little hit or miss in the sticks, and when I finished my business, I decided I might like to get a bite. Turns out she was my waitress, and as she came to take my order, she set a slice of pie on the table next to my elbow. "To say thanks," she said. "That order would have come out of my paycheck, and it was a biggie. What can I do for you?" One hamburger and fries later, and after a piece of absolutely heavenly apple pie, I made a point to stop by any time I had a delivery to make in Taylor. I made good on that promise, and I probably stopped a few times when I didn't have any reason to be there either. In the time between the bear in my trailer incident and the time the music almost lured me into the woods, I probably ate at the diner a dozen times or more. Your grandmother commented on it, telling me I was becoming quite a staple at the Wild Skies. I think she knew I was there for more than the pie, and she often came to sit and chit-chat with me as I ate. We struck up a friendship and shared a little about our lives before coming here. Turned out she lived in Tennessee before moving here at the age of 15. She had dropped out of school at 16, seeing no reason to continue going when she didn't know anyone, and had been working here ever since. It was kind of nice to have someone else from the same area who'd been uprooted by the government, and we talked a lot about the things we missed back home. For her, it was the peaches. Your grandma loved peaches, and if there'd been a way I could have gotten some here without spending a small fortune, I would have. So after going there for around a year and a half, I came in one afternoon after a pretty sizable delivery to Taylor. I had lugged furniture for the better part of 2 hours out to the back of my truck, and though far from in a state to woo, I was determined to get a good meal and see your grandma. It was dark, the sun doing that thing where it doesn't rise but for a little while, and I was glad to see that the crowd was sparse for a change. The Wild Skies diner was usually packed, and it made having more than a passing conversation difficult. She smiled as she saw me and came out to take my order, as we did the usual pleasantry chit-chat. Then, so quick I almost missed it, she leaned down and asked me if I would stay until she got off a shift. I told her I didn't mind, but just as I was asking why, she got a call from the kitchen and had to run. I scanned the crowd, wondering if maybe someone was bothering her, and that's when I saw the fella in the long coat. He was tall, probably in the 6-foot range, and his head was covered with a muffler or a balaclava. I wondered if maybe he was one of those Russian holdouts you sometimes heard about, the ones who sometimes lived in the wilderness to avoid being sent home, 'cause he looked pretty burly as he sat there drinking his coffee. The longer I watched him, the more certain I was that he was no Ruski. He had a smell to him, not right on top, but lower than most people can smell. Things that aren't quite people sometimes have that aroma, and the longer I watched him, the less I liked what I saw. I felt pretty sure that this was what had spooked her, and I wasn't looking forward to having to square up with him if it came to it. Your grandma sat down as she brought out my food, putting her back to the guy. She put her head in her hands and just kind of shuddered. It wasn't a tired or a cold shudder. It was the shudder of someone who's been stalked by something not quite of this world. Thanks. I don't think I could have walked out there at the end of my shift if someone wasn't with me. I don't think I've ever seen you spooked like this. What's going on? Do you see that guy in the balaclava? She said, eliciting a nod from me. He's come in for the last 3 days, and always near the end of my shift. Some secret admirer? I asked, trying to keep the jealousy from creeping in. If he is, he's having the opposite effect. He tried to follow me to my car last night. If Andre from the kitchen hadn't come out to give me my apron that I'd forgotten, I don't know what would have happened. We talked a little more as I ate, and when I was done, she took my dishes and kept my coffee refilled as I waited. It wasn't a long wait, maybe an hour, and she kept me company throughout. She was nervous, constantly looking at the guy in the coat, but I'm ashamed to say I was mostly just glad for an excuse to be near her. I had been working up my courage to ask her on a proper date, but I didn't think she'd have any interest in an old roughneck like me. I was almost 6 years her senior, not as uncommon back then as it is now, but it still made me feel a little weird. How would her parents feel about their 17-year-old daughter dating a man almost half into his 20s? When she smiled at me, though, when she touched my hand or my shoulder, or when she laughed at one of my corny jokes, I almost didn't care. She came over to the table with her purse and her coat just as I was finishing my 5th or 6th cup of coffee, and thanked me again for waiting. As we walked to the door, I saw the guy get up and drop some money on the table. It was coins, and they looked weird even from here. I took note of the way his clothes moved and the weird straining they seemed to do, and put a hand on something I kept on my person since the incident with Soap Sally. The leather was softer than when I'd first tooled it, having ridden many miles and over many lands, but the runes were still dark and bold across the front. It had worked on the old hag. Let's see if it'd work on whatever kind of boogin this was. I had parked next to her without meaning to, and as we approached her car, I pressed my keys into her hand. Go get in the cab of my truck. The doors are thicker, and I'd rather there was some metal between you and him. She nodded, not questioning as she went jogging to the large truck parked beside her smaller truck. It was a beat-up old farm-all with chains on the tires, and her old man had clearly favored something sturdy over something pretty. With good reason, too. The Alaskan weather was hell on vehicles, and it was clear that this one had seen a few winters here. With her safely stowed away, I turned to the thing in the coat and made myself as big as possible in my threadbare jeans and my patched winter jacket. The lady isn't interested. Take off and leave her alone. The giant in the balaclava cocked his head, but instead of yelling, it bleated angrily at me, like a goat. Now that it wasn't under a booth, I noticed something else, too. It had hooves. Its dark protrusions were planted in the snow, the shiny ends clapping a little at the ice as it came forward. "I said leave," I reiterated, and was surprised to find that my voice didn't shake when I said it. "She isn't interested in you." As I said it, I brought the sigil out of my pocket. The creature had been walking forward, thinking it could bowl past me, but the sight of the sigil stopped him in his tracks. He seemed at odds with himself, the same foot coming forward and sliding back several times before he finally decided to make a move. The sigil had halted bigger creatures than this one, and I felt certain it would do for him as well. Even so, when he started charging, his hooves eating up the pavement, I was mighty scared. That might sound weird after hearing me talk about standing against the bone collector, but you're never 100% sure the magic will come to you till it does. It's still like that sometimes, but it was with me that day. He came within 3 strides of me and suddenly impacted a solid wall of force. He bounced off, sliding across the concrete as he lost his cover and was revealed. He was a huge and furry thing, a satyr or some kind of goat man, and he bleated angrily at me before taking off. When I heard his hooves retreating off into the wilderness, I finally put the symbol away and went to check on your grandma. She had watched the exchange through the front window of my truck, and it seemed to amaze her that I'd put the whatever it was off with nothing but my words. She asked what I'd been holding up, and I showed her the sigil and told it was something my grandma had taught me to do. I expected her to scoff and tell me I was crazy, but to my surprise, she had some experience with these sorts of things too. She had lived in haunted houses and had strange experiences with things in Tennessee when she was a girl. The idea that something otherworldly might have followed her didn't seem so far-fetched. I did some digging and discovered that something had been abducting young women in the area for years, though this wasn't an uncommon occurrence. Sometimes people went missing, and if the family was lucky, the police found their remains when the snows thawed. Many of them were shanghaied by less than reputable fellas who lived out in the sticks and became unwilling brides for their growing clans. Your grandmother's fate, though, would likely have been much worse. We sat for a while and just talked about things I'd seen and some of the things I'd done, and when she realized that it was almost 10 o'clock at night, she said she really needed to be going before her mother would worry. I asked her if I could take her out sometime. Surprising myself more than her, she smiled and said she'd wondered when I was going to ask, and we made plans to have dinner with her mother on my next day off. That was how your grandmother and I began dating, and it would begin a very strange balancing act within my life. It wasn't easy working and dating and learning magic from the man in the woods, but I suppose that's what your 20s are for, aren't they? If you're gonna burn your candle at both ends, might as well do it while you're still young enough to bounce back. I smiled to myself as I listened to another of Grandpa's wild tales, the scuff of the tool on the wood making an appropriate background to the tale. At this point, I couldn't even remember a time when I was skeptical of his stories. Grandpa could have told me that he'd saved Grandma from a dragon, and I would have likely believed it. I'd seen so many wondrous things in my time here with my grandpa, and things I would have questioned even a year ago seemed as normal as grocery shopping now. How'd you convince Grandma to move the length and breadth of the country just for you? Grandpa chuckled. That wasn't even the hardest part. The hardest part was convincing your new girlfriend there not to challenge your grandmother for my affection. We were married by then, though, so wasn't a lot that Glimmer could do about it, even from the stance of her people. But I think that's a story for another day. Let me finish my bird, son. There's whippoorwills that ain't gonna carve themselves, unfortunately. I left him to it, going to see if I could find Glimmer before it got too late. We've been spending a lot of time together,
and I wondered if my own grandparents' move would be as long as the move the two of us would have to make for me to meet Glimmer's parents. Despite living in the woods that I love so much, sometimes it seems like her family lives on a different planet. As I grabbed my coat beside the door, I guessed I'd cross that bridge when it came time.
You're still here. Thanks so much for joining us for tonight's spooky tale. If you'd like a little bit more spooky in your life, why not click on one of the videos that appears at the end of our story, or maybe head on over to one of our playlists where you can get your fill of spooky content. If you like your spooky a little more tactile, I've got a new book that's come out. If you'd like your own copy, there's a link below in the description where you can get your own copy of my spooky book. If you like what you see here on the channel and think you might like to support in a more monetized way, then why not come over to Patreon or become a member on YouTube? Speaking of, let's go ahead and thank our members now. Thanks to Civ Garstad and Unicorn Hollow for being our spooky ghost contributors. Thanks to Saikat, Lee Kendall, Janet, and Chris Kinsella for being our spooky skeleton tier contributors. And of course, thanks to Xaronan, Winter, Tyler Parker, Stephanie Carrington, Sarah ASMR, Hi Stacy, Emily Coltsfoot, and Cinnamon Fox, and Bella Lee for being our ghostly reader tier contributors. Thanks everyone, we just couldn't do the show without you. As I said, if you'd like to have your name read out at the end of every episode that I make, and maybe get a little more, come on down to Patreon and sign up, or become a member on YouTube. Ghostly Reader tier contributors get a book anytime I write one, which is usually about twice a year. So, what are you waiting for? Come on down and give it a look. And as always, thanks for stopping by. Dr. Plague, signing off. Have a wonderful evening.